Greetings, YouTube. Recently, I have read two different products that dealt with psionics in the overall D&D universe. The first was a different take on psionics for the Pathfinder First Edition game, and the other was a take on psionics for the Fifth Edition of Dungeons and Dragons. Um, and in both cases, the people that wrote these products, completely unrelated, no, really not connected in any way. They referred to psionic abilities as spells. Now, for me, I've always very much traditionally thought of in your classic D&D or for Pathfinder First Edition, there was arcane, there was divine, and then there was psionics. And then Pathfinder came along and threw in psychic spells because they were wanted to do this kind of gothic, seancey vibe kind of thing with stuff right out of uh, uh, gothic horror. So they wanted to have this kind of psychic spells and psychic abilities with a different kind of feel than your arcane or your divine or your psionic. So that's fine. That's its own thing. It isn't. They weren't passing it off as psionic abilities. They were passing it off as a slightly different view of spellcasting from a different narrative. The narrative being gothic horror, essentially. Um, and so I didn't mind that, but I read it. I thought it was okay. Was it called the occult something or other? It was all right. It introduced the kineticist, which I thought is a pretty cool cat class. Um, and I just moved on. Okay. But I've always loved psionics. Back in first edition, when they weren't very well defined and they weren't very well done, in my opinion. Second edition, which really didn't do any improvements. And then it comes along third edition and 3.5, and we finally have the best version of D&D psionic rules I've ever read, which were written for 3.5. And then Wizards of the Coast decided to completely abandon the entire community of 3.5 folks that loved the game and move to a new demographic. And so the rest of us were stuck with a game that was now finished. And then Paizo stepped up and said, hey, we'd like to offer you the opportunity to play a better version of 3.5. Here's Pathfinder, which at the time was the only one available, but of course now it's Pathfinder First Edition. And they passed off the creation and support of psionics to a company called Dream Scarred Press, which was an absolute genius move on their part because it means that they didn't have to worry about it, but also because the team at Dream Scarred Press are frigging geniuses and created the best psionic rules I have ever read, not to mention the best spell point system I have ever read. If you're into spell point concepts, this could easily be adapted into that as opposed to being read as a psionic ability system. But I loved it. And one of the things I love about it is because the flavor is different. It is not arcane spells. It is not divine spells. It's not psychic spells. It's psionic powers. And that nomenclature, powers versus spells, is very important to me in the way I look at that narrative. For me, Psionics has always been a part of D&D, and it's particularly useful if you have kind of a science fantasy thing going on in your game. But even if you're just doing high fantasy, there's no reason you can't have psionics existing alongside the arcane and divine. And in fact, there's no reason you can't have transparency. So say, for example, an anti-magic spell works equally well with psionic abilities and prevents them from functioning. And the reason I think that's important, because I don't really want to have two entirely different trees of spells or abilities that block arcane magic in one case or divine magic and then psionic separately. That's just a little bit too much. If you know you have skills in knowledge arcana or knowledge psycraft, they're fairly applicable to the other side of the coin. Maybe you don't get the same bonus, but you're still relatively well versed in arcane magic if you know psionics, and you're fairly well knowledged in psionics if you know arcane. Or rather arcana, I should say. Um, but I want the names to be different because that flavor that lives in my head wants it that way. It just seems right for powers to be called powers and spells to be called spells, and never the twain shall meet. But apparently, other folks don't have a problem with it. As the two products I mentioned to you at the beginning of the video, both of them came up with have decided to call psionic spells spells, and it just felt wrong with me. In the same way that a high fantasy set of rules that uses the metric system seems wrong, or a system of science fiction rules that uses the imperial system seems wrong. If you're doing science fiction, use metric. And if you're doing high fantasy, use imperial. I want hogsheads and rods. I want spans and hands. You know what I mean? I want drams and things like that. I want things that are arcane and strange and weird and stuff that most people don't even understand what they mean. I mean, how many of you off the top of your head know how long a chain is or how long a rod is? I know both because I'm strange. Um, but I want to know how important that is for you folks when it comes to the nomenclature of the systems and the abilities therein. Does the flavor of something matter to you? Or are you system neutral? You just don't give a crap. Whether you call the fireball spell a spell, or you call it the fireball power, or you find or you call it the telekinetic spell as opposed to the telekinetic power, does it not matter to you? Are you swap those things back and forth without even thinking about it? Or, like me, do you feel that certain things fit certain genres or certain types of practices? In this case, the difference between arcane, divine, and psionics. Those are different paths. The arcane is the manipulation of the magical energy of the world around you. The divine obviously comes from an external source, or at least from the veneration of an external source, potentially from the power from the people's faith in and of themselves. And then you have the psionics, which is traditionally viewed as from within. I think they're all very different. I think they all fit into a system. They all should be able to work in a high fantasy setting. I got no problem with them. I also don't have a problem with firearms. So I'm sort of a kitchen sink guy, I guess. But today I want to talk about the terms that we use and how important they are to the narrative that we are trying uh, to write and the narratives that live in our heads. Do you think spells should be called spells? Do you think powers should be called powers? And do you think it's weird when those terms are not used?